welcome back. You're watching continuing coverage of the World Healthcare Congress. I'm Pramod John, and in our studio right now, Pramod John, who is looking at the drug affordability issue, and he's got some thoughts on that. Thank you so much for being here, Pramod.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, that is really a big topic of conversation about these drugs that people are innovating and bringing to market and that cost so much. But the big question is, do they work? How do you address that?
You know, that's a real interesting question because I think all of us can see sort of the big issue around cost. It's in everyone's agenda, everyone's talking about it, but the real question I think that we're not addressing is the question of, well, how well do these drugs work? And I think we generally, people are talking about comparative effectiveness, Washington's talking about it, and we're talking about some of these issues from a general perspective, but ultimately the question is really the question not of even if it works in general, it's that when a patient is prescribed a drug, the real question is, does it work for them? And the only question that matters at that point is if it's working for them or not. And if it doesn't work for them, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't work, right?
Okay.
Because that's the person who's been prescribed, and that's the person who we're trying to actually solve a problem for, in this case with the drug.
But what measures are we using? I mean, you're not just using one person. You've got to go out there and really do the tests and get the data points, correct?
Yeah, it's a real interesting point that you bring up, because if you look at the drug trial process, the way that drugs come to market is they go through drug trials. And all of us often assume that there's a standard associated with when we even say that a drug works. Because it turns out that's not the primary concern of the FDA. The FDA's primary focus is on the question of safety. So they're really asking the question of, will it harm you, is the first question they're asking. They're not really asking an objective question of, does it work?
Is that the wrong question to ask then?
In many ways, one could argue that maybe a better question when we're paying an average price of $50,000 plus, and some of these orphan drugs are $500,000, $1 million a year per patient, maybe it would be a fair question to ask, does the drug actually work?
Okay.
And if so, what does that mean?
Okay.
And that's the question that today we just take for granted, because as soon as the FDA approves something, the assumption is that it works.
That it is effective. So where do you think this needs to be adjusted? What needs to be changed in the process? Because we have a very active, vibrant biotechnology community that is innovating and supposedly coming up with things that are very interesting that are effective.
So, the part of the question is that, are you asking at the level of an individual or for example, from a public policy perspective? And why I ask that question is that those are really two different answers, because all of us want cures for everything. But if we step back and ask, look, if society is going to have to pay for these cures, then the government and the people who pay for these things should have some say in determining where we put our research dollars. And if you look at most of the research dollars today, very little of it goes into sort of large-scale benefit for society, or how do we do things or create new innovations in the drug space, for example, that benefit the largest part of society versus a great deal of, the majority of drugs last year that were approved by the FDA, a majority of them were for orphan diseases that affect very small populations within our country, or within the world for that matter. And so those have turned into very profitable things for drug companies, but benefit, as far as society goes, there are a few thousand people in the United States who have some of these orphan conditions. And they're not targeted at all towards what is the overall good for the dollars that we're spending in research, even if we were spending all those dollars on research.
What is your role at VIVIO?
Our role is really to, currently if you look in the market today, there really aren't any solutions that are addressing this issue specifically of not the question of how does it work in general, but the fundamental question of when we prescribe something and someone's on a therapy, is it working for them? And the term that is used in the industry around this is this real question of real world effectiveness. And so we're really addressing the questions of real world effectiveness associated with these therapies, and on being able to collect data. So we're a data and analytics company that collects data on patients, how patients are responding to these drugs, and also that allows us to compare drugs against each other to understand, well, how do these generally work? And at that point, we can also assess things like, well, what is a reasonable price to pay for this drug? Because right now we have no way of coming up with a metric. A drug company says, we want to price this at X. Well, what's your rationale to say, No, we think it should be wide.
Right.
Today there is none because
Right.
we have no data on our side to suggest what the drug actually does in the real world.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there, Pramod. Thank you so much for your time today.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much.
And I'm Pramod John. Stay tuned, we'll have more content on the way.